Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We resume our discussion of cultural materialism, and maybe I'll just make a few quick points, and then after that, we'll try to discuss some important concepts in Michel Foucault. Rather, we'll return to some important concepts in Michel Foucault, and then we'll close this discussion of new historicism and cultural materialism. Day before yesterday, I was talking about one important work by Catherine Belsey, where she was talking about subject of tragedy and how she studied not only literary texts but also political proclamations, legal texts, notices, and many such texts like conduct manuals. And then she discussed the nature of the subject at that time. I mentioned another important name while discussing Catherine Belsey, and that name was that of Michel Pichou. Michel Pichou. I'm not talking about Foucault at the moment. Michel Pichou, Pecheux. His important work is Language, Semiotics, and Ideology. Language, Semiotics, and Ideology. Now, Pichou also talked about the role of discursive structures. That means he also talked about discourse, just as Michel Foucault talked about discourse. And here he talked about three important categories. And what are those three important categories? One important category is the category of a good subject, and then a bad subject, and then a subject who likes to negotiate a certain position for himself. Now here it simply means that if there is a kind of position which is offered to a subject, to a person, to a reader, to somebody who receives something, then how does that person negotiate that position? So if something comes from dominant source, if something comes from the official channel, if something comes from a position of power, and that particular thing appears very, very powerful kind of discourse, but does the subject accept that uncritically? Does the subject reject that? Or does the subject seek a different kind of modality for himself? And here he tried to conduct an experiment also. And what was that experiment? He gave his students a particular text to read, and this was a text of economics. And one particular group of students was told that this is a right-wing text. Another group was told that this is a left-wing text, whereas the text occupies a kind of centrist position. And the result of this experiment was the students who were given this impression that this was a right-wing text, they interpreted that text according to their understanding of the right wing, and they selected some words, some phrases, some sentences from the text to suit their interpretation of that text as right-wing text. And similarly, the other group of students who were given to understand that it was a left-wing text, they understood that text as a left-wing text, and they also selected some passages, some sentences, and some phrases from the text and offered a kind of left-wing view of the text. Now, this suggested the role of some ideas which are there, which may not be there in that text, but those ideas influence the interpretation of that text. So that means those ideas, a particular kind of discursive structure which prevailed, that influenced the reading and interpretation of that text. whereas the text occupied a kind of centrist position. The idea which Belsey finds interesting in Pishu's work was this idea that if something is given to a reader, if something is given to a subject, if something is given to a person who receives that thing, then it is not necessary that that person will accept that thing uncritically. That means this is a position which is very important in cultural materialism, because cultural materialism is also interested in the question of resistance to the dominant ideology. Cultural materialism is interested in a kind of critical engagement with the dominant ideology. And so something like this may happen. A particular kind of, suppose there is a particular kind of advertisement, or there are different kinds of advertisements that we see. Now those advertisements are maybe meant for women, or maybe they are meant for students, or maybe they are meant for say government employees, or maybe they are meant for common people. Now how do government employees or women or common people accept or take those advertisements? One way is that they become kind of good subjects. And when they become good subjects, and good here in inverted commas, when they become good subjects, they accept the discourse in those advertisements. They accept the ideas in those advertisements. They accept the view in those advertisements. That means when they accept those positions, they become good subjects, and they seek a kind of identification with that position. On the other hand, there is the bad subject who rejects that view. Boys, why should boys have all the fun? Suppose there is this ad. Why should boys have all the fun? Why should boys have all the fun? And you can also think about similar advertisements which talk about, say, girls, for example, which talk about equal status for girls. There is one subject which says, okay, fine, I accept this view. There is another subject who says, no, I don't accept this view. And the third kind of subject who negotiates a different kind of position. That means with some modifications, this position is changed, accepted, or rejected. But in other words, there is no total acceptance, there is no total rejection, but a third modality, and this modality is called disidentification. That means you have identification, and when you have identification, there the subject becomes a good subject. When you have counter identification, the subject becomes a bad subject. And where there is a third modality, disidentification, that means there is some kind of negotiation which is involved. When we read those Renaissance texts produced during the Elizabethan period, suppose they talk about the power of the queen, suppose they talk about the power of the crown, suppose they talk about monarchy. Now one view is that, okay, whatever is said about monarchy, that is accepted. Whatever is said about power, that is accepted. That means there you have the good subject. The other view is that no, it is not accepted, which was rare, but it was still the case. And the third modality with some changes. In new historicism, usually it is the first or the second modality which is important. That means the good subject and the bad subject, identification and counter identification. Whereas in cultural materialism, it is also the third modality, disidentification, which is also very important. And that's why this position is interested in resistance. Cultural materialists are interested in the question of resistance, and they are also not closing the possibility of resistance. So this is the work of Michel Pichot, and this influenced somebody like Catherine Belsey, right? There are other aspects of cultural materialism where we can say that they were greatly interested in a kind of transgressive position or a kind of oppositional voice. And that's why you see that when they are interested in a kind of oppositional voice, their work also interested somebody like Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. And her analysis of power, knowledge, and how power influences knowledge, which is a very important subject in colonialism. So this also comes straight from the work of Michel Foucault. So maybe we can close our discussion of cultural materialism at this point. But since there was an interesting question, and that question was about the role of Raymond Williams. And as I said just now, that Raymond Williams is a very important influence on the work of cultural materialists. Raymond Williams and I talked about two specific concepts. One was the concept of structures of feeling, which Raymond Williams talks about. And the other concept is the concept of residual, dominant, and emergent aspects of culture. Residual, dominant, and emergent aspects of culture. So I'll just explain this concept once more. Structures of feeling, Williams deliberately uses the word feelings for, say, ideas or for intellect. That means in every age, there are some ideas which are not properly articulated, which are not properly expressed. But these ideas can be found as structures of feelings in works of literature. And if these ideas are read closely, or if works of literature are read closely, then we can possibly see some kind of opposition to the dominant ideology. That means if we are talking about texts written during the Elizabethan period, then we may come across some passages, some lines somewhere where you can identify that kind of structure. You can identify that structure of feeling which is not clearly articulated, which is not clearly said, but which suggests a different line from the official line, a different line from the line which comes from the dominant power. So for Williams, this becomes an important aspect of works of literature. The second aspect of Williams' work, and which is especially very important, is he talks about what is called epochal analysis. That means analysis of an epoch, maybe epochal analysis. And there he says that no dominant culture or no dominant order completely exhaust the possibilities of something which emerges, something which is antagonistic to this order, which emerges, and similarly no dominant order can also eliminate the possibility of something which is residual, which is left over from an earlier period. So that means in the dominant order, you can see these two threads also. You can see these two strands also. One is the residual aspect of culture, something which is coming from a different period. That is the residual aspect. So, for example, one talks about environment, one talks about, say, love of environment, one talks about, say, kind of pastoral tradition. Now, this may be something from an earlier age, but even if society is completely industrial or post-industrial, so something of an earlier age, when you had agricultural economy and when you had that kind of agricultural pattern of life, so that leftover thing, that residual thing can also be part of the dominant culture. Similarly, something may be emerging which may not be very obvious. Something may be emerging which may not be very visible, but that something which is emerging, maybe it provides a kind of challenge to the dominant order. So that is the emergent aspect of culture. So you have the residual aspect of culture, you have the dominant aspect of culture, and dominant aspect of culture is something that you always see, and you have the emergent aspect of culture. When we talk about all those works which were written in the Elizabethan period, and why I keep mentioning Elizabethan period, why I keep mentioning the texts written by Shakespeare, because new historicism and cultural materialism basically study texts written during that period. That means their frame of reference is those texts written in the Elizabethan period. So when we think about that Elizabethan period, that means it was not the beginning of the modern age yet. It was not the age of capitalism as such, and it was not completely the age of feudalism either. So a particular period was gradually emerging. And if we think about a play like Measure for Measure, and you have say many of those characters who are based in city, and we say that this is also a play which is a city comedy. You have say a lady who is running a brothel house, but that is just one way of looking at her work. There is another way of looking at her work, and that is that she is also a kind of female entrepreneur. She's a businesswoman, right? And on the other hand, you also have certain things, certain laws which probably come from an older period. So that means you have the residual aspect of culture, which is very much part of the play Measure for Measure. And you also have a certain strand of capitalism or a different kind of culture which will replace the culture of the Elizabethan period. You know that capitalism will emerge on the scene. The idea of entrepreneurship will emerge on the scene. But you already see a hint of that idea in this city comedy. And so when cultural materialist critics are reading those works, they are looking at this aspect of Williams' work, where you can see the residual aspect, where you can also see the emergent aspect. And it is especially the emergent aspect of culture which is very important, because you possibly see hint of things to come in a work. And so these two ideas in fact complement each other. Structures of feeling, that means in a work you can possibly see some kind of intervention, some kind of opposition to dominant ideas. It is not very clearly articulated, but it should be read properly. Something should be read between the lines to arrive at that kind of understanding. And similarly, no discussion of culture can possibly, or no dominant order can completely eliminate the possibility of something which is emerging and also something which is residual, right? Here we can also mention three important works, although there are a number of important works, but three important works which use this approach, cultural materialist approach. Now, one work, alternative Shakespeare, alternative Shakespeare, and you know that this was a work written in the New Accent series. In one lecture earlier, I had talked about different series brought out by different publishers. So New Accent series, and I mentioned, say, structuralism and semiotics also in this series, or deconstruction also in this series, and many such important works. As the title itself suggests, new accents, new accents. So here, alternative Shakespeare, and you can say that something is suggested by the title itself, alternative Shakespeare. So first it came out in 1985, and then you had another edition of this work, and then you had yet another edition of this work. So that means the most exciting kind of criticism on Shakespeare which has been produced in the last, say, 30 years or so, which is very much part of this particular volume, alternate, say, what you call alternative Shakespeare. And similarly, say, Terence Hawkes, again, somebody who wrote structuralism and semiotics, he also wrote a famous work, that Shakespearean rag. And here he's talking about the fact that Shakespeare has been processed. Shakespeare has been processed gradually. And he's talking about four important critics. Say Bradley, T.S. Eliot, right? Dover Wilson, and your own Walter Raleigh. At how Shakespeare has been processed. That means how Shakespeare comes to us, and how Shakespeare comes to us through different institutions. So this is an important work. And similarly, another important work, which was, say, the Shakespeare myth, right? The Shakespeare myth. The Shakespeare myth also looks at this question: how the myth of Shakespeare was created, and how the myth of Shakespeare has been created. And you know that there was a whole tradition of what you call bardolatry. Bardolatry. That means you have the word bard, and the word bard refers to Shakespeare, and bardolatry, say, kind of worship of the bard. So that tradition. So if you look at these works, they also suggest, say, the nature of criticism on Shakespeare. But important thing about these works is that they also look at the present. They also look at Shakespeare from the position of the present, from the perspective of the present. And so for this reason, everything becomes important. If Shakespeare is presented in Heather, that also becomes important. If Shakespeare is presented in many of those versions which were created in the West, that also becomes important. So we close our discussion of cultural materialism and new historicism on this note. Now, we don't have too much time, but quickly I'll just mention some important concepts in Michel Foucault. We have already discussed those concepts, but maybe we can just discuss those concepts again. First of all, think about the word discourse. Don't be confused by this word discourse. The word discourse is used in a very different sense in linguistics, and it is used in a very different sense in cultural theory. So first of all, think about linguistics. The study of language usually was confined to a word or to a sentence. Grammar talked about sentence. But then there appeared a particular approach to the study of grammar where one talked about the grammar of the text. And that means one thought about going beyond a sentence, going beyond a sentence. So the study of language going beyond a sentence was also called a study of, say, its text. And there the word text and discourse were often used in a synonymous manner, right? So that is one perspective in language. But then some change was also made, or discussion also ensued, where discourse referred to something which was spoken and text referred to something which was written. But then again, this distinction was also not maintained by everyone. And the third, say, perspective that you can see here is that discourse refers to the pragmatic aspect of a text. That means you have words, you have sentences, and you have their meanings. But meaning also depends on number of different factors. And what are those different factors? The intention of the speaker, the context, right? The intention of the speaker, the context. So if I use this sentence, he very carefully put that thing. He very carefully put that thing under the chair. Now, do you understand what is said? It's a complete sentence. He very carefully put that thing under the chair. Now, because we don't have the context, we don't have the intention of the speaker, and we don't know. So that means there in language study, discourse is one particular area. And it means how people make meaning. And how people make meaning, they make meaning on the basis of, say, social context, on the basis of words, on the basis of intention. So you can say that discourse is something which we, say, take out from a text. So for example, if I say that I am teaching this class with a lot of interest, or if I say that, or think about one line from a text, and that line is, and this line comes from an advertisement. There is a lady, and the lady asks somebody, and in fact, the lady is telling somebody, "Shadi ho tumse," and her tone is very, very, say, angry at that time, maybe. But second time, maybe she rather she eats something or she's presented something. I have forgotten the product, but she again says that "Shadi ho tumse," and this time her tone is very flippant, very playful. That means first time the answer is absolute no. Second time the answer is yes. So in both these examples, what you see is you have the sentence, you have the text, but you take out discourse from that text. You take out discourse from the text. So discourse refers to, in language study, say, a pragmatic process of meaning making, right? So don't be confused by that word. Then there is yet another meaning of the word discourse. And what is that other meaning of the word discourse? Discourse, he offered a discourse on religion, lecture, a formal kind of talk. He offered a discourse on language. He offered a discourse on religion. That is a kind of very formal kind of talk. Discourse on reason, discourse on theft, discourse on declining morals, and so on. So that is the other aspect of the word discourse. But the word discourse is also used in critical theory. And there the word discourse is very close to the word ideology. very close to the word ideology. Discourse is also very close to the word, to the concept speech acts, right? So discourse as ideology, discourse almost the same meaning as the word ideology. So this is something which we find in literature on discourse. Another thing that is important here is that the word ideology or the concept of ideology comes from the Marxist tradition. Marxist tradition. Whereas the word discourse does not say find as much favor with critics who do not come from who come I'm sorry, the word discourse is often used by critics who are not necessarily from the Marxist tradition. So that is another distinction. And that's why we can possibly think about somebody like Marx and Engels who defined the concept of ideology. And when they defined the concept of ideology, one meaning of ideology was ideas of the ruling class. Ideas of the ruling class. And then you know that Althusser also made a distinction between two different kinds of structures. One kind of structure which is based on force, repressive structures, force, army, police, judiciary, and the other kind of structure that was called ideological structures. And their ideology was very important in Althusser's work. So where ideology was important, it was believed that it is through the force of ideas that people do whatever they do, and their ideology becomes their common sense. So that means that Althusser is talking about the concept of ideology, and this concept of ideology is very close to the concept of discourse, which Foucault talks about, right? So here we can possibly discuss Foucault in greater detail now. I would like to conclude this discussion today itself. So maybe we can meet after 5 minutes break, and I won't have the complete 40-minute session. Maybe I'll take 15, 20 minutes, right? So just bear with me. If this meeting ends, we need another maybe 15 or 20 minutes, not more than 20 minutes, and I promise you, right? Because Foucault's work is important here. So when we look at the concept of discourse, it has different meanings. And there is yet another area. That area is called critical discourse analysis. And in critical discourse analysis, you see kind of meeting ground between those linguists who use the word discourse to refer to something going beyond a sentence, and critical theory where the word discourse is used as referring to ideology. In critical discourse analysis, we have both these two positions combined. So there it is talking about language, but it is also talking about language in terms of some ideological